All right. The title of today's webinar is Stereotype Threat in Academic and Clinical Settings, Creating Identity-Safe Spaces for Students and Patients. Thank you all so much for joining this 60-minute presentation, which will be followed by 30 minutes of discussion time for questions. If you are calling in today, please be sure to mute yourself during the first portion of the presentation. We organized today's webinar in the Equity and Midwifery Education series to provide us with an opportunity to collaborate and learn from one another as we seek to implement change. We also hope you will join us for future webinars and calls. I'd also like to give a big thank you to the Foundation for the Advancement of Midwifery, who provided a microgrant to support the speakers in this webinar series. Somebody's unmuted. Also, for those of you who would like to engage on these topics in a different format, please join our equity strategy and collaboration calls, which are designed to be very interactive. And you can find all of this information from the main website, www.equitymidwifery.org. You can also find out more information about future events and past recordings here. And now I would like to introduce our presenters. So we've got our pictures here, and I think I'll probably make this a little bigger so that we can actually, maybe you can read it as well, if you'd like. Cynthia Bilu is a clinical professor in the Nurse Midwifery Education Program at UCSF, where she has taught for 18 years. She is on the Diversity in Action Committee at UCSF and has been recognized by students as a leader in creating optimal learning environments for marginalized and struggling students. She has spoken on the topic of stereotype threat to multiple audiences at the local and national level, and along with a colleague won university funds to bring experts to the UCSF faculty for a workshop on the topic. She has received multiple awards for excellence in teaching, and we're so lucky to have her presenting today. Also with her co-presenter, whose picture's going to go away a little bit, but we can read better. Thank you so much for being here, Brianna Matthews, a second-year student in the Nurse Midwifery and Women's Health Nurse Practitioner Program at UCSF, where she is also a teaching assistant. She received her BSN from Emory University in 2014 and has been working as an L&D nurse over the past 4 years, including now as a student. She currently enjoys serving mainly low-income, uninsured women of color from various backgrounds. She has worked as a nurse and a birth and postpartum doula in a variety of settings, including freestanding birth centers. She participated in a program providing maternal child health quality improvement training services in Malawi and has a minor in and passion for global health. Currently, she is doing research around cervical cancer disparities and barriers to cervical cancer screening and prevention among African American women. In her free time, though I'm not sure how she actually has any, she enjoys meditation retreats, traveling, and spending time with her husband. All right, well, I would love to turn the presentation over to our presenters finally. Thank you so much, Cynthia and Brianna, for being here with us today. I think I need to hit stop share. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much to Kristen and to Brittany for the valuable work that you're doing and for creating this venue where I can share this information, which I'm really excited to be sharing. And thank you also to Brianna for contributing to this presentation, which is particularly impressive because she has both a final exam and a paper due tomorrow. Okay, and I think we are here almost. Okay, so are you able to see my slides?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So, whoops, wait a minute, we're not advancing here. So here we go. And 1 second here, sorry. I'm just gonna take myself out of the video feed here. Okay, so stereotype threat is a really serious obstacle to success for marginalized students. And I feel like it's a key responsibility of faculty and preceptors to understand it and understand how to reduce it for our students. Because if we don't, we just end up perpetuating disparities. It's also relevant in clinical care, and we would just touch on that piece towards the end of the presentation. There are literally hundreds of experiments showing how stereotype threat undermines the performance of students. And fortunately, there are many measures that are often pretty brief and pretty easy to implement that are shown to reduce stereotype threat and improve both the health and well-being and the performance of stereotyped students. So what is it? Well, it was first described by Claude Steele in the mid-1990s, and he has a book about it, which is really excellent, entitled Whistling Vivaldi. And it happens only in specific situations. When a person is identified as a member of a stereotyped group, and they encounter a challenging task, and they're being evaluated, and they are invested in doing well, then there is a fear that could be conscious or unconscious that they will be evaluated through the lens of the stereotype. And then they worry that they're poor, if they perform poorly, they'll confirm the stereotype and it'll cause their group to be judged or to be treated badly. So what ends up happening is that person gets engaged in monitoring the environment for cues that the negative stereotype threat is relevant here. And they develop anxiety about their performance potentially confirming that the negative stereotype is true. And it's really upsetting to think about this myth of your group being inferior. So there's a lot of self-regulation where they're attempting to suppress the negative thoughts and the emotions, to not feel them and to not show them to others. So it takes a lot of energy. It's very onerous and exhausting to be attempting to self-regulate your internal state and how you're seen. And so it leads to a physiologic stress response. And it's basically a distracting multitasking situation where you're trying to read the cues in the environment and monitor yourself. And so this leaves less mental space to be present and engaged with the task of learning. And it actually impairs the memory. And all of this leads to underperformance. So then if the faculty or the preceptor isn't wise to the situation and takes their performance at face value, it creates an even more frustrating situation that makes it even harder to stay engaged in learning. And it reinforces the idea that my group doesn't have this ability, people think my group doesn't have this ability, and I don't belong here. So Claude Steele has described it as like living with a snake in your house. Basically, the person is driven to a constant unconscious vigilance. You're always scanning the environment for cues that you might be being seen in view of the negative stereotype. And it's not just like performance anxiety or test anxiety. Anybody can get frustrated and anxious about a challenging task, and anybody can be concerned about that people might think badly of them if they don't perform well. But the difference with stereotype threat is that everybody around you knows this negative stereotype, and your poor performance could confirm a judgment about your group. So in fact, people who are the most highly motivated to succeed and people who are well prepared to succeed are susceptible to stereotype threat. And it's situational, because what you'll see from the research that I describe, if the individual is put in a situation where the stereotype threat is removed, then it's not an issue and their performance improves. And it's not all in the head. It's a social situation that intersects with the individual's psychology. Because in fact, it's not irrational for example, for people of color to expect to be subjected to negative judgments, to stereotypes, to microaggressions. So it's actually adaptive to anticipate encountering prejudice or bias. And there's this, ends up being this extra pressure that requires extra competencies to manage the situation. So some examples. Stereotype threat is very common. We pretty much all of us experience it in one situation or another. For example, women in math, just asking women or girls to check off their gender before they take a math test leads to them having lower scores on the test. Women drivers, when women are about to take a driving test, if they're exposed to a negative stereotype about bad women drivers, and they make twice as many errors on the test. There's a lot of research coming out about aging and elders. For example, when elderly women are about to take a grip test of their strength is actually weaker when they're exposed to a negative stereotype about aging. It's really relevant when it comes to size and weight discrimination. And of course, it's really relevant to us as educators that there's a stereotype about the intelligence of Black and Latinx folks that is widely known throughout society. So for students of color, stereotype threat is a really significant factor in the learning environment. So it's important in this process to reflect on our own experience of this, because it helps us inform how we respond to students. So I'd like for you to just take a moment and maybe go ahead and type into the chat box. Think about a stereotype that you've experienced. How are you stereotyped? And how has this impacted you in your life? And we'll come back to that later in our discussion. And there's this performance gap, basically, where if you take African American or Latinx students who are matched for past performance and preparation with white students, that they consistently have poorer academic performance. And even when you compare like a middle class Black student, they will actually do worse than a poor white student. But there's a lot of evidence that when you remove the stereotype threat, that it equalizes their performance. And so in experiments, it turns out it's incredibly easy to either evoke or erase stereotype threat. And these experiments are in the lab and in the real world academic setting. So in some of the earliest experiments, they took college women who were in advanced math classes, and their test scores tended to be a full standard deviation below that of men. But when they give them an exam and they say, you may have heard that women tend to not do as well on these exams, but that's not true of this exam. On this exam, women do as well. Then that completely erases the stereotype threat, and their grades jump up to be equivalent to that of men. Another early experiment was they took African American college students and gave them a really hard nonverbal intelligence test. And if they told them it was an intelligence test, they did poorly. But if they said, you know, this is just an interesting problem-solving exercise, then their scores jumped up and became equivalent to that of their white counterparts. And there's a lot of really compelling evidence. It's been very dramatically replicated by researchers. So what this leads us to understand is that grades and test scores are systematically underestimating the intellectual ability of students who are exposed to negative stereotypes. So we tend to assume that when we look at like past, you know, grade point averages and SAT or GRE scores at a low, medium, or high level of performance, that accurately reflects something about the student's ability. But actually, what it's really reflecting is something about the learning environment. And this was demonstrated in a really beautiful meta-analysis where they looked at nearly 19,000 students, most of them in the real-world academic setting. And the students were categorized at low, medium, or high levels of past performance based on their GPAs and SAT scores. And that bottom dotted line represents the test scores of stereotyped students under conditions of stereotype threat. So basically, like they were given tests, but the stereotype threat was not removed. The dark line reflects that the performance of non-stereotyped students was consistently above that of stereotyped students. And then they exposed the students to a variety of manipulations designed to remove the stereotype threat. And they looked at their subsequent course grades or GPAs. And you can see here that the performance of the stereotyped students actually leapt up above that of non-stereotyped students. And so what this tells us is that past performance was suppressed by conditions of stereotype threat. And when we remove the stereotype threat, then we remove the factor that's been suppressing their performance, and we can then see what their true abilities are. And there have been several subsequent studies that replicated these findings. And when they analyzed this, they found that these findings suggest that the SAT score systematically underestimates the ability of African American and Latino students by about 40 points. And so our grades and our test scores are reflecting the psychological context of the learning environment rather than the true ability of the student. So this, of course, has major implications for admissions and advancement. And some programs, including ours at UCSF, have completely dropped consideration of the GRE scores from their screening processes for admission. Claude Steele describes the situation as like evaluating the performance of a track star. And if you evaluate their speed while they're running into a stiff headwind, then you're underestimating their capacity and you won't have an accurate assessment of their true abilities. So stereotype threat is like that stiff headwind. So stereotype threat is thought to explain a lot of the academic achievement gap. And it alters the trajectory of people's lives because it leads to people dropping out of programs or taking longer to complete programs. And it's a really big and serious issue in higher education. It's an obstacle to social justice, basically, because people who are subject to stereotype threat there are extra competencies required of them in order to succeed. And it also leads to mistrust, because basically these students can't ever really know if the feedback that they're getting is just plain constructive feedback based on the task, or is it coming out of that stereotype? So it can lead to a hypervigilance in situations of being evaluated. And it can also lead to over-efforting and code switching, which are really exhausting. And Brianna, are you up for stepping in here to speaking a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I reached out to a few of our peers, both in the class above me, below me, and some of the students in the MEPIN cohort. And MEPINs are essentially students who are in an accelerated bachelor's program and who are advancing to the master's program. And they are essentially students who have a background in something else, a bachelor's in something else, that they are coming in without any RN experience. So I reached out to different students just to get an idea of what the impact has been on for them in regards to stereotype threat. And what I found were just this overarching this idea that students often felt like, particularly students of color, often felt like they had to perform 10 times more than other students who were not of color. Specifically, one student gave me an example where in the clinical setting, she felt like she had to work 10 times harder than a lot of the students in her class. She also felt like just doing the bare minimum was just not enough. And in turn, this impacted the care that she gave her patients and also affected her psychologically. She felt that she, in a way, had to prove to her preceptors.
We're losing you, Brianna.
She may hear why. I'm not thinking outside of the setting, particularly for people who identify as African American. Some students have felt like they've had to essentially code switch while they're in the hospital. They feel like they need to talk a certain way. What they call is talking more white, talking more proper. And they feel as if they may be judged in a certain way by not only their patients, but by the preceptors or anyone that's interacting with them. So those are a few examples that I've seen in the clinical setting, as well as other students, and then we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along throughout the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. I think that really those descriptions of student experiences really demonstrate how much energy it takes and how distracting it can be to be in these situations.
Absolutely.
So, and what you're describing highlights that even though much of the research is about, the classroom and test scores, that it's a factor in clinical learning environments and in simulations as well as in test taking. And so I thought this study was particularly relevant to our midwifery students in clinical settings or in simulations. And basically in this study, they took 200 female undergraduate students and they put them in a 3-day simulation-based training on tactical decision-making. And one group was exposed to negative stereotypes about women's analytical aptitude prior to the training. And this group, basically it not only impaired their performance, but it impaired their ability to really organize and integrate their knowledge. And they ended up being less efficient, at performing the tasks that they were trained to do. So just kind of bringing it into the clinical setting. And then I also have an example of one of our past midwifery students, and I'm using this example with her permission. So this student is the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and she had taken a step out year from the program. And before she stepped out, she had had just a couple of labor and delivery shifts. But now she's back in the program and she's back on the birth unit. And she, in that shift, that first shift, she's really overwhelmed and she's really struggling. And unfortunately, her preceptor had the attitude that she hadn't worked hard enough to prepare to be back on the unit, and that she really needed to like get her act together. And so basically what this was doing was invoking the stereotype of the lazy Mexican. And one of the issues on the unit that day was that she, there was a perceived lack of ability to read fetal monitor strips. However, the next day, the student was meeting with her advisor, and she was in a situation where she felt safe and supported. And when she was given the opportunity to read fetal monitor strips, she basically did fine. You know, she hadn't studied in the intervening time, but she was able to read the strips with like 90% accuracy. So this is, I thought this was a really good example of stereotype threat in the clinical setting on the student. And that student wrote really eloquently about her experience of being a student of color on a birth unit where most of the patients are Mexican and Central American immigrants, and most of the care providers are white. And this is what she wrote, and I'll just give you a minute to read this.
Cynthia, I wonder if you might want to read it or have someone else read it just for the folks on the phone.
Oh, right, I forgot about that. I will read it. So she said, I come from a similar background as most of the patients here. I often find myself feeling helpless, stressed, and concerned about the care the patients received. I witnessed labeling, blaming, patronizing. And although my primary job as a student is to learn, it was nearly impossible to focus on learning when there was so much more going on in the interactions among and between the staff, the students, and the patients. And this affected me in many ways. I have learned that I am not alone in my experience as a student of color, and that I'm not unassertive, unprepared, over-emotional, or slow. I felt challenged and broken down by the lack of awareness and understanding for these non-academic issues that some faculty and preceptors labeled as academic when I was dealing with all that entails being a student of color in the program. I did better in classes where I felt respected by the faculty. So I think what all of this leads us to is that for students subject to negative intellectual stereotypes, the nature of the learning environment determines if they can live up to their potential. And it's our job as educators to get the stereotype threat out of the environment so these suppressed abilities of stereotyped groups can be freed up and everybody can benefit from the unrecognized potential of these groups. So why do we engage in stereotyping? Well, you know, there's several answers to that. Partly it's just built into the human brain that when we see a pattern, we tend to make a rule about it. And that works well when you think of like math or biology, you know, if you add two even numbers, you'll always get an even number, but it doesn't really work when we apply it to human beings. It's kind of a cognitive shortcut in a complex social world that the brain puts people into groups and assigns characteristics to the group rather than going to the trouble of seeing each person as an individual. But it's also more than this. You know, we tend to think that if we can just like purge the individuals of implicit bias, that the problem will go away. But in fact, racist stereotyping it's not just based on ignorance. It's also born out of a history of white supremacy, of enslavement, and xenophobia. These stereotypes have been produced by people in power to maintain power. And so because of this history, the structures of our institutions, of our academic institutions, were created in this environment of white supremacy. And we need to think about that. And it's our responsibility to be explicitly anti-racist. So, and actually this little image should have been on the previous slide. If you're not familiar with the work of Ibram Kendi, he writes really eloquently about this history. And basically the threat of stereotype is everywhere. It's just in the air because we live in a society that is organized around racism and sexism and other biases and stereotypes. From the beginning, our society has used race to assign disadvantage and advantage to groups. And our academic institutions were built on this. They were largely built by white people for white people. Like, consider that, a lot of our pedagogical principles were devised in an era prior to having the diverse student population that we have now. So we need to look at that. We need to consider if these principles still work in a population from such diverse backgrounds. And some triggers are more overt, being the only one of your group or one of only a few would elicit stereotype threat. Whereas if there are others like you, then that signals that you belong here. The surroundings often can be very invalidating, and of course, microaggressions communicate assumptions about competence or assumptions about belonging. And so this is why things that might seem benign, like mispronouncing people's names, or lumping people together as a group, has really profound negative impacts. So I'm going to start talking about how to reduce stereotype threat, but I thought I would pause here because this is a lot of information to see what questions or comments you might have.
Anyone who wants to, put a question in the chat box, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to unmute yourself if someone. I actually raised the question about code switching, and then Brianna answered it because while I was familiar with the concept, I didn't know that term prior to today.
Uh-huh.
Is there anyone who wants to unmute and ask a question at this point?
Okay, so I will proceed then to start talking about how we can reduce stereotype threat. What can we do? Well, fortunately, there's a ton of research that describes a lot of interventions and measures and skills that reduce stereotype threat and improve performance. And these, we can kind of categorize these at the societal, institutional, and individual student level. At the societal level, obviously, we can work to remove biases and stereotypes from society and eliminate racism. And that is, of course, beyond the scope of this talk. But we can also work at the academic level to look at the things about the environment and the structures of the institution that are obstacles, and also at the interpersonal level between the faculty and the student. And then a lot of the interventions focus on the student, given that it's actually difficult to control all of the cues that can trigger stereotype threat, and that stereotyping is not likely to go away really soon. What we can do is provide the students with strategies that help them cope with the threat, that make them more resilient to stereotype threat. And this is an outline of the interventions that I'll be talking about here. So first thing, we need to create validating spaces, right? We need to make sure that there are plenty of cues in the environment showing that everyone is welcome here and that everybody can be successful here. And we also need to have multiple groups represented in leadership, and to show that people from all backgrounds can move up and move into leadership roles. So this is my example of a invalidating environment. When you walk into our medical sciences building, there's this hall of white chancellors. There's all these beautiful historical portraits of former chancellors of the university, and actually they did add a Black man at the end there not long ago, but prior to that it was all white men. There are no women, even though there have been female chancellors. And while this reflects certainly that these people made valuable contributions, but also it reflects that this university was created in an environment where other groups were not given the same opportunities. And this is an example of a validating space. In our School of Nursing building, with this, these posters reflect our first generation to college group. And they have these beautiful photos of both students and faculty who are first generation to college, linked with traits like tenacity or resilience or badassery. And we also have outside these large posters that show faculty and students from diverse backgrounds. Another thing that we can do is make sure that there's plenty of representation of providers of color and connection with them. So, having speakers and panels be providers of color in the community. There's been research showing that just assigning an essay by a person from a marginalized group as a reading in a course actually improves performance of marginalized students. And in a world where, unfortunately, at this time, we are a mostly white faculty, one of the things that we have done is create a formal program to connect students of colors with midwives of color in the community as mentors and support that relationship. So, have like events and dinners that bring people together. And we also need more people of color in the teaching role. And so, for example, I'm in the process of lining up guest lectures for a course. And this is a course in like GYN, sexual and reproductive health. And I'm finding there are not a lot of providers in this role who are of color. And who might be prepared to like step in and just do a guest lecture, which is what we typically do. But I'm realizing that we can have another role. There can be a role of content expert where the person can, review your slides and your exam questions and maybe do part of the lecture and come to the lecture to like help answer the students' questions. And so this is a way to have more representation and to also cultivate their potential as educators in the future.
And just to burden Cynthia, I wanted to mention, just to go back to having guest lectures, that has historically just been an issue within our program in terms of determining who does our guest lectures. And a lot of students have felt or have experienced forms of racism and have heard racist comments, not mainly from our faculty who are here full time, but a lot of them have encountered this from our guest lectures. And so that is why we think that it's really important to selectively choose who we would like to have come in as a guest lecturer. And that in itself is really important. And it's important too, because we need to have guest lecturers who understand the culture of UCSF, and then also see that students can identify with whoever the guest lecturer is. So particularly guest lecturers of color is what the emphasis is being put on.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that, Brianna. That really has been an issue in our institution and in our program, and speaks to not only finding people who are attuned to the culture and the issues, but bringing them along if they're not, like be sure to get their slides ahead of time so that you can review them and, see if there are any issues or any things that indicate maybe a lack of understanding on the part of the lecturer, so that you can work to expand their understanding so that they won't end up inadvertently triggering stereotype threat. Creating trust is a really key piece, and it can be a big challenge in creating a diverse community. People have very rational reasons not to trust that the environment is going to see them and support them. And so all of us in education need to see building trust as a fundamental part of our responsibility. And this can involve providing explicit cues of respect and value and belonging, and actively negating these negative stereotypes, which are in the air, right? Students are constantly being exposed to them. So we really need to be proactive. And we can't expect that people can just leave their identity at the door, and we can't be colorblind. We have to be really willing to engage and get comfortable with having conversations about identity and race. And as one example of the type of vigilance that is needed, these are questions that were in a nursing test bank that weren't caught by the faculty and ended up the students being exposed to them. That just so reinforce stereotypes. In planning for a health fair at a shopping mall, the nurse would anticipate which cultural group to most value preventative medicine: Northern European Americans, Native, Latino, or African Americans. And there's another example here of the kinds of things that our students can end up being exposed to if we're not really, really vigilant. So, I'm sorry, let me see where I am here. So, to start talking about some of the interventions and measures that are focused at the level of the student. One of the things that we have begun to implement is providing biosketches. The students write biosketches, the faculty and the preceptors write biosketches, and for example, before going off to a new clinical rotation, the biosketches of the faculty and the preceptor are exchanged. so that they can read them before meeting each other. And Brianna, would you like to talk a little bit about your experience of this?
Yes. So all of us, we write biosketches and we send them to our preceptors for each quarter. And the purpose of the biosketch is essentially just to give our preceptors a general background on like who we are. It's so busy in the clinical setting, and oftentimes we don't really get a chance to get to really know our preceptors, especially when you're working in busier facilities. And so what we've been doing is sending these biosketches to our preceptors with hopes that this will be like the first introductory session with our preceptors. We'll get on a nice, we'll be on a nice foot with them. And the expectation is that they'll read them. And so what students have found is that the biosketches are extremely helpful in terms of preceptors getting to know students. But some of us have run across the issue of preceptors not actually reading the biosketches, and sometimes we go into the clinical setting and we are essentially sort of expected to perform at a certain level, but without the preceptor really knowing what our background is. And so a lot of us feel that the biosketches are extremely helpful. A lot of us want to tell the preceptors who we are, but a lot of us kind of want to keep that quiet and sort of learn on the same level as everyone else. So for an example, me being an experienced registered nurse, that's something that I would put on my bio sketch, and as well as all of the experiences that I've had as a student midwife. But a student who has not had RN experience would essentially put on their bio sketch that they don't have that clinical RN experience background, and that they would just put their midwifery related experiences in the clinical setting in the program. And so essentially this sort of creates this this idea that there are certain people and there are certain students who are not. So overall, we feel like the biosketches have been extremely helpful from the student standpoint, but can sometimes be a little harmful if preceptors are using that to compare students. And then on the other side, we haven't had biosketches done from the preceptors, but that's something that they're actually working on putting into place for the future clinical placements. And so we've actually felt that that would be helpful if we had preceptors who were sending us a brief bio about who they are, because we also don't get a chance to get to know them either. So that's currently something that we're working on, that we're doing. And I think that's been helpful in terms of eliminating this idea that mainly for us students of color, that we are going into this feeling as if these preceptors are automatically making certain assumptions about us because of our appearance. I particularly feel like the biosketch helps for me mainly because I'm a student of color, as well as I identify as being a Muslim as well. And so I like the idea of my preceptor getting to know me personally from a piece of paper first before actually seeing me in person. For some reason, that is what's more comfortable for me. So in a way, I feel like the biosketches have really helped with that piece.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brianna. I think your description there illustrates that there's some complexity to it, and some thought that needs to happen about kind of what goes into this biosketch, and that of course the students have complete control over, you know, what they reveal or what they don't reveal. The principle behind the biosketch is that when the student is seen as a whole complex individual, you know, with unique capacities and strengths, then that helps to ensure that they are less likely to be viewed in terms of the negative stereotype. So it's kind of bolstering a more complete identity. And also it taps into social belonging issues. Social belonging has been a big topic of research in the field of stereotype threat. And because, you know, everybody worries that they're going to be accepted in a new environment. And people are always looking for signs of, you know, do they belong here? Or will they be valued here? But for people from stereotyped groups, it's particularly deeply felt, and they're especially sensitive to signs of not belonging. Because the question is not just, do I belong, but do people like me belong here? So there are seemingly trivial cues about belonging or about connection can have a really big impact. You know, so like if the teacher doesn't smile at you or call on you, or your peers go out, you know, after class without you, then it raises your doubts about, do people like me belong here? But conversely, finding just trivial things in common, like, you know, you both have a dog, you like the same music, has a really big impact and kind of builds an on-ramp to relationships. So one of the ways that I've used students' biosketches is I study them before I start teaching a course, and I make a little cheat sheet, and then I go early to classes, and before the lecture starts, I mingle and talk to people, and I say, oh, you have a dog, you know, I do too, or, you know, you're from Humboldt County, I have a friend there. You know, if you find these little things to connect, then you're you know, building a foundation for them to reach out and for more of a relationship later on. So turning now to what the research has been. And there's four different types of interventions that have a great deal of research. And all of these are focused on the student, on providing the student with strategies to cope with stereotype threat. So let's look at these. So one of them that is actually newer on the scene is basically just teaching students about the existence of stereotype threat. It's kind of taking the knowledge is power approach, and these really great researchers did a study on it, and, you know, basically find that there's like this aha. It's like the students say, oh, now I understand what's really going on, and that it's not just about me or my group and our capacities, but that there's a larger social phenomenon that I'm being subject to. And so basically teaching students about stereotype threat. And one way that we've implemented this is in the first quarter, and actually I think Kim Doe is on this call as the person who teaches this course, and you're welcome to jump in. In the health disparities course, which is in the first quarter of the program, the students are taught about stereotype threat. And Brianna, would you like to say a little bit about like what happened there and how it impacted you?
Yeah, so all of us in our first quarter, we take the UCSF Health Disparities course, and essentially we are evaluating different health disparities, both here in California and just all over. And within this course, we cover different topics in terms of implicit bias, explicit. We talk about all forms of racism, and one of the topics was actually on stereotype threat. And so a lot of us were introduced to this concept in that class. And for me, I feel like one thing that's really unique about UCSF is the fact that this course and this content is incorporated within our program at the very beginning, and it shows that this is something that they value, and that this is something that is very important to discuss. And so we had very intimate conversations in regards to stereotype threat. And we actually had a really nice reading assignment where we evaluated the different ways that stereotype threat can affect patients within the health settings. But one thing that I thought was interesting was we didn't evaluate too much on how it impacts student performance. But one thing that did stand out to me within that course is we evaluated the performance of African Americans in comparison with people who are not of color. And we saw essentially what Cynthia had mentioned earlier, different test scores were identified for students for African Americans who were essentially tested in the same environment as people who are not of color. But then we saw that those test scores improved when they were put in an environment with just themselves. And we've also, throughout that course, we had opportunities to not only read different articles about how stereotype threat affects the patients that we serve, but also we got to do different journal assignments where we got to really reflect on our experiences with stereotype threat and different biases. And we just got an opportunity to really evaluate our experiences and how it has really impacted us. And just to mention, the title of the course is Racism and Health Disparities.
Great.
Put that in the comment section.
Yeah, thank you. So that experiment about test scores when it's only African American students in the room versus mixed with students of other races, was that something you read about or something that you actually did?
Yeah, it was actually something that we read about.
Okay, got it.
Where we evaluate it.
Yeah.
So
great, thank you. So in this study on this, they call it Speaking Truth to Empower, and they basically randomize people to different groups and put people under conditions of stereotype threat, and then found that in the students who were educated about stereotype threat, that they were less worried about confirming the negative stereotype, that they were less concerned about, that they would be a bad ambassador for their group. And it actually improved their performance, not only on a test, but in general course grades. And the citation for that is at the bottom of this slide. There's tons of research about social belonging. And basically it's designed to diminish students' concerns about if they fit in a given environment, and to normalize their experiences of not belonging. Because basically when a stereotyped student encounters a setback, like they do poorly on an exam, or they're feeling left out socially, if they think that this experience is not typical, then it leads to them feeling like people like me don't belong here, and they withdraw their energy from the learning environment and don't do as well. But if they believe that this is just a typical common experience for all students, then it doesn't have any negative connotations for them or their group, and they end up continuing to be engaged with the learning environment and getting better grades and doing well academically. So there's this major social belonging intervention that's been done literally with thousands of students. And typically what they do is they take students coming into a program and they have them either read or view a video of a previous college freshman, a freshman from last year, telling a story about how, when they first came into the program, they felt like they didn't belong here, and everything seemed really hard, and and so on. But then over time, they realized that actually everybody is feeling that way. And it's just a normal part of the transition into a new program to experience these uncomfortable feelings, that it's normal and it'll pass. And then to take them out of feeling like they are somebody that needs help, they have them write a letter about this to a future student to help them with the transition. And this is also something called saying is believing. So it helps them to take the ideas in more deeply. And what they found is that a huge impact, that people were less likely to drop out of the program, and they had a higher GPA a full year later. They were healthier and happier. They made less use of student health services and student mental health services, and they reached out sooner and more often for support and to connect with the resources that would help them be successful. So this is huge, and it's really easy. It's pretty easy to do. It's this intervention takes like 20 minutes, at the beginning of a program. And there's an organization called the College Transition Collaborative that has really detailed information online about how programs or faculty can design these interventions for their own programs. They need to be customized for the program, and there's a lot of key psychological principles that need to be integrated into the stories that they read. One place that we see this is, think about this, is when students are coming onto the clinical unit. That's a big place where they're in a new setting and they don't feel like they belong there. And one of my colleagues, Ana Delgado, highlighted this and created a really friendly and warm and detailed orientation to the clinical unit for new students in the clinical setting. One of the other big interventions is about values and affirmation, where basically if students are reminded of their purpose for being here, that it leads to better performance and less likely to drop out of the program. Because they can focus on their strengths, and their capacities. And when they use it early in the program, they've seen positive effects on grades up to 2 years later. And typically what's done is you give people a list of values and they select a couple of values and write about them. Why are these values important to them? And maybe think of a recent time where they did something that demonstrated that value. It's usually online. There's no follow-up discussion. It's like a class assignment that they get like a point for participating. And so one of my colleagues did this in our program, and I think she might be on this call. And basically we came up with a list of values specific to midwifery students and had them select a value and write about it. You can see the questions here. They were to think about a time when they incorporated these values, into their life or their work. We also were trying to get them more connected with each other. And so we asked them to think about how the values connected them to their classmates. Brianna, would you like to say anything about your experience of this?
Yeah, so we were introduced to this concept last year, and we all found it to be extremely helpful. What we thought was that it would have been great to have this during orientation week, where we're sort of just really identifying our values and writing them down and having this post-it somewhere where we can constantly refer to throughout the quarter. And I thought this was a great tool for us to bring back that love and the desire to serve the communities that we serve, and also to remember why we're doing what we're doing and why we came to this program. But I also think that this activity is really helpful, mainly for us students of color who may have or may have not experienced these levels of stereotype threat within the clinical areas. And I think that this is just an essential tool for us when we do run into these issues within the clinical settings. This is something for us to go back to and sort of remind us what our values are, and sort of like serves as this piece for us of this important piece. And yeah, I think it was a great tool, and I still refer to it to this day.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's so easy to forget, like, why am I doing this? You know, when you're in the middle of exams and papers and you know, challenges. Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that. In one of the pieces of research, they did it in orientation week, and then again right after the midterm. And basically, everybody benefits from it, but the underrepresented minority students received a disproportionate boost in their grades from doing this. And we'll skim through that. Yeah. Another area of research is about growth mindset interventions, where, and I think probably most of you are familiar with this, it's kind of permeated society now, that basically when you praise people for, when you say, oh, you're so smart, then that makes them feel like that if the next time they don't do well, it'll mean they're not smart. And so it makes them actually avoid challenges because they're concerned that poor performance will mean that they're not smart. Whereas if you praise them for effort, if you say, wow, you worked really hard to do this, then they're much more likely to see struggle and mistakes as just part of the learning process, rather than it meaning something personal about them. And they're more likely to engage with challenging endeavors in the future. So this is another one of those things that helps everybody, but it disproportionately helps those who are subject to stereotype threat. And there's research about this, that it basically, I'm sorry, I'm going to skim a little bit. Oh, basically that it improves, you know, improves performance for people. And there's actually the intervention was really simple. There's a Khan Academy video about stereotype threat that's like 10 or 15 minutes, and they just had students watch that. Like that was basically the intervention, and it had really good results. One of the ways that I think this is relevant is that some students are really traumatized by simulations. And sorry, losing my train here. We devised this strategy of making people more comfortable with in the simulated learning environment, where beforehand we really give them a lot of messaging that this is about learning, not about being evaluated, that it takes courage to do this, that it's easier for some people than others, you know, introverts and extroverts, and that we expect them to make mistakes, that we will be disappointed if they perform perfectly, because mistakes are really important for learning. So we have a lot of kind of language and psychology around preparation for our simulations that makes it easier for stereotyped students. Okay, coming towards the end here. Another really key place where stereotype threat comes up is when students are struggling and when they are put onto academic probation. You know, you have to give them that letter, right, that says you are on academic probation. And what happens here is that if the feedback that we give students is not psychologically attuned, then they end up feeling shamed and scared, like they failed, and it can actually be a really devastating experience for them. They get concerned about, you know, how am I viewed by my school? And, you know, how we manage this can really either add to their struggle or mitigate it. And so the College Transition Collaborative has this whole entire toolkit that programs can use to basically normalize the student's struggle and validate that there were probably very specific reasons why they're encountering this challenge, and convey a lot of respect and hope, and that this is a growth process, that they're not being labeled. And there have been 20 studies with 3,000 students showing that when you have this psychologically attuned approach to giving feedback, that students are more likely to stay engaged, they're more likely to reach out to resources that will help them, and they're more likely to return to good academic standing. And this piece here actually could be an entire webinar in itself. It's a really important piece that deserves more time than I'm giving it here. And I have a few slides about stereotype threat in the clinical setting for patients, but I think instead of going into that, I might pause here since we're towards the end of our time, and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Cynthia. You and Brianna are such a wealth of knowledge and information. We are really so grateful. We haven't had a lot of questions come into the chat box. I'm wondering if anyone wants to unmute them. I always have questions, and so I've got a list here. But I'm wondering if anyone else has any questions that you've been kind of brewing up that you'd like to unmute yourself and be able to ask Brianna or Cynthia or both.
Yeah, I'm curious if anybody sees sees the impact of stereotype threat on their students, how you see it, and what kind of things come to mind that you might be able to do to mitigate it.
I was going to ask you, but you answered the question, just is it a good idea to talk about it with students? I just sort of did that intuitively with a student, and she started doing better on tests after we talked about it. And so, yeah, it's sort of just, you know, an N of one, but confirming what your research showed as well.
Yeah. And that was a really fast and simple intervention too, you know, where they basically just provided people with a short paragraph about what stereotype threat is, and asked them to think about a time when they experienced it and think about how they might cope with it when they experience it again. And that was it, you know, like a 15-minute intervention.
Please, anyone, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment.
And actually, I'm going to unshare my screen here.
This is Jody. I just wanted to say this has been one of the most helpful webinars that I've been on for quite a while, just as an instructor and a student coach. I'm seeing so many ways that I can apply this in ways that I just want to support my students as a coach. And as an instructor, I can see many ways in my course right now that I can begin implementing supports to really help my students perform better and to feel better about their performance. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Jody. I'm really happy to hear that. Are there any specific things that come to mind that might impact, what you do with your students?
I have one student who's a student of color who just failed the NARM for the 5th time. And I'm really confident in this student's capabilities, her competence, and I'm curious if just having a conversation about this would make a difference.
I'll bet it would, because part of the principle is that when students are struggling, it's called reattribution, right? They can see that their struggles are not just about them personally or don't indicate their deficiencies, but is part of a larger context. And that is so freeing. I mean, as someone who experiences stereotype threat myself in some settings, I have found it to be really freeing.
And the student that I spoke about talking with it about, we talked about stereotype threat and then we brainstormed together, if I start feeling like some of this might be coming up, what can I do? And it was just, kind of thinking about midwifery care, right? Taking some deep breaths, taking yourself to your happy place, and we talked about, how many questions you can get wrong. Because if every wrong question sort of brings up, I'm not smart enough, these questions are too hard. Maybe talking about, if there are, 1,000 questions on the NARM, you get to miss 200 questions.
Yeah. I think that also, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Cynthia.
I think that also speaks to, that students from marginalized groups are more likely to need a really specific roadmap to success, because the academic setting and how to do well in it may not be as familiar. And so having a really specific path laid out is really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And particularly as a student of color who have friends, we've all struggled with this issue of test taking, specifically standardized testing. And that's something that I even struggled with in undergrad with test taking, and even with the NCLEX exam that we had to take, with me not passing on the first try. And I identified really what the issue was. I believe stereotype threat definitely had some sort of impact on it. And I think what really helped for me was to first identify that, and then also to work with other people of color who don't struggle with test taking, and examine what their strategies were. And I figured out a strategy that worked for me to pass the NCLEX the second time. And it was really just a mindset. It wasn't it wasn't about not knowing enough. It was really about me really believing in myself, believing that I was quote unquote smart enough to be able to pass it. And I think that's what a lot of us of students of color, sometimes we feel like we are inadequate, and we feel like we don't really know enough. And so I think that there's a lot of like mental work, self-care work that we have to do on our end, and having someone there to sort of guide us towards that is extremely helpful.
Thank you so much, Brianna.
Yeah. So I ran out of time and didn't make a resource list, but I will create that and share it. The College Transition Collaborative and the Mindset Scholars Network have a lot of amazing detailed materials online to help faculty to implement some of these measures. And so I'll put those links along with a few key articles and videos for people to explore further.
Thank you, Cynthia. That would be awesome. And I will send that out in the follow-up email with the recording as well for folks to be able to access. We are coming to the end of our scheduled time. Is there any other burning something that someone wants to get out before we kind of do our final wrap up?
This is Lauren. I hope you can hear me. I just wanted to say thank you, and also that I think for me, the thing that helps the most is fighting racism and stereotypes and trying to change the conditions that create the need to address stereotype threat. And I think the more that we can challenge that environment, which this is very applicable, of course, to the education of people from a very early age, the more we can get at the root of this problem and change our society, I think the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, hear, hear. I think that sums it up.
It does. It sounds like a good place to wrap for now, and we'll have more time together if we want it. So that's the beauty. The first opportunity for that, again, is going to be Wednesday, January 23rd. I hope you will all try to make our first book club. And if you don't read the entire book, you can still come, but it would be even better if you've got the book now and started reading it. And I think that you'll find useful information and that we can learn together next month.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah. And everyone, we would love your feedback on this webinar and any ideas for future topics or speakers. Brittany's going to post our survey, so please give us that feedback. Again, all of the information is on the website about future events. We will have webinars in 2019. They're just not quite set yet. I want to thank again Brittany Blanco for her behind the scenes work to help this call run smoothly. And especially to Cynthia and Brianna for all your important work and for being willing to come and share this information with us today.
Woohoo! See you next time.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.